streaming on Disney Plus, Ron Howard, famed director, just released a documentary on the Muppeteer himself, Jim Henson. This film is called Jim Henson Idea Man, and this follows the life of Jim Henson, essentially the beginning of his career as he is becoming this puppeteer in Hollywood, as he's trying to establish his career, finds out that he has this just comfort working with puppets, and where it goes from there, from Sesame Street to the Muppets to the live action debut of films. Like, this guy is someone that started off so small, started off the Muppets on SNL, and then became a global sensation with his famed characters of Kermit, Miss Piggy, Fozzie Bear, all of that. And going into this documentary, I always have a few questions with documentaries, and I think both of them were definitely in play, especially as we're dealing with a movie about a famous person that a lot of people admire. If you've listened to Ron Howard's interviews about this documentary, you can tell Ron Howard relates to Jim and clearly idolizes the man. So in that all, I wanted to focus on these two questions to frame my review. And I think they're the two most important questions to ask about this said documentary. Could Jim Henson Idea Man be presented with any form of objectivity despite being made with the full participation of the Henson estate, all while being produced by Disney? And the second question I had is, would a Jim Henson documentary offer insight into the artist's vision, or would it be far more concerned with the iconography of Henson's career? With both of those ideas, that's how I wanted to frame this review, because this is a review about a celebrity, someone that was beloved. I think it is easy for this to become self-indulgent really quickly, especially when you have an artist like Ron Howard who clearly looks up to him, and you have the Henson estate all on board making this film, with Disney, the current owners of the Muppets, giving this film licensing to exist on their streaming service. What surprised me right away with this documentary is just how good of a documentarian Ron Howard is. There is an interpersonal play to him as a filmmaker in this role, which feels very suited to tell the story of someone like Jim Henson. It does feel more personal than a lot of documentaries about famous people feel. And specifically, you can understand right away where Ron Howard relates to Jim Henson. You see the similarities in their career. They're both people who got their start on TV. They are both well-natured, funny people that audiences had an instant warmth and connection with starting at a young age. And then there are also these filmmakers that had just more in stakes for themselves as artists. They didn't want to be boxed in. They wanted to be experimental. They wanted to branch out and do movies. They were fascinated by the big screen and the little screen. And you can see right away where Ron Howard is approaching that. And this workman horse quality that Jim Henson has, you see that in Ron Howard's work. And that is the fascinating part of this film, where you get to see Ron Howard understanding who Jim Henson is as a person and as an artist through understanding his personal life. And this documentary focuses a lot on the Jim Henson estate, specifically the kids of Henson, as we learn quite a bit about the Henson marriage, these two partners who started this team of the Jim Henson Company, really just envisioned everything. And you see this marriage growing apart, you see the struggles of it, and specifically you see the impact that it is having on the kids as they're growing up, and as they have this father in Jim Henson who clearly loves them, but is also just so dedicated to his craft that he's struggling to, if not make time for them, he is struggling to connect with them as much as maybe he should. There is this not fully absentee father. I don't think that's what the kids are ever trying to imply in there, but there is just this growing tension of having a father being this famous and so beloved and being so inspirational to other kids and maybe feeling this little bit of absence. There's a psychological aspect of this documentary that, again, never places blame on anyone in this film. I think this is quite a loving portrait of a father figure, but it's also acknowledging just some of the flaws in this human being, where he struggled, and society as a whole in the 1960s, 1970s, because they spend a little bit exploring just the gender politics of the 1970s and how Jim Henson, his marriage kind of suffered for that, and some of his maybe old school beliefs, or at the time, I guess, modern day societal beliefs on where women belonged in the workforce. That's not really the point of this documentary, but it is explored, and it does just kind of bring to light more about what Jim Henson is facing as an artist. And this film really does focus on some of the iconic moments throughout the career. Specifically, we get to learn a lot about the Frank Oz relationship and how these two were just kindred spirits, how they connected right away, and they made something really special together. And of course, as someone who loves the Muppets, that was the part of the documentary that was the hook for me, getting to see where Kermit evolves from, getting to see Miss Piggy essentially break through on screen, seeing these characters' direct relationship to Saturday Night Live as they're performed on the first season of SNL. The Muppets are on the first season of SNL. They, eventually get passed on over, or they get removed from the show, but that's the base inception of the Muppet Show from the 1970s. And you understand where that humor, all that evolves from, and why the Muppet Show is structured the way it is. That all was exciting to me, to just kind of discover the trial and error of the Muppets, which started off far more adult and then blended some of those adult sensibilities with some of those more childlike sensibilities that we saw in Jim Henson's already successful Sesame Street movies. And then you also see this portrait of an artist who is far more curious about filmmaking. I don't think people necessarily think of Jim Henson as a risque director or someone that's even particularly experimental. I feel like because the Muppets and Sesame Street are so in the mainstream, we think of him as a mainstream studio director, but this is clearly someone who wants to experiment with form, who wants to experiment with what can be seen on television and movies. This is someone who is fascinated the same way George Lucas, the same way Ron Howard, the same way Robert Zemeckis, Spielberg, all these great directors of that era were fascinated in technology and the ever-growing speed of which technology was coming. You see Jim Henson essentially practicing CGI in its really early inception, and just seeing how much of a pioneer he was. And this film gives him credit for that. And I think that's where some of the aspects of the self-indulgence can feel at place. I think Ron Howard's a far more careful director than that it never falls into that trap. But there are certainly moments where it's just like, you can really feel it being like a studio presentation of this man in his honor, and essentially a biography, just telling his story without really exploring more of it. I think that the film suffers from that in moments, but those moments are far and few between. So in that idea of the Henson estate, would it be hard for objectivity to be in here? I actually think there is a lot of honesty in this film, especially in the kid's relationship with him. It's not this glowing portrait. It is quite literally a man who has to work his whole life and dies working. And we understand why he does that, and we understand the joy that it brought him in his life and the joy it brought countless of other people. But we also see the cost of that, and the film does explore the cost of that and coming to terms and accepting that. And I think the children are a pivotal aspect in that. In terms of the Disney involvement in this movie, I would say that there is a very clear ending to this film that involves Disney, and it kind of just wraps everything up in a bow. And that was certainly a moment where I'm just like, if that wasn't a studio note, I don't know, but there is certainly an aspect of even the way the pacing ends with the film where I was just feeling like this feels like Disney self-promoting. So the film does fall into that trouble at times, but again, it's pretty far and few between. And in particular, Disney's name, I don't think it even gets mentioned until the final 10 to 15 minutes of this film, when Jim Henson essentially sells the Muppets / the Jim Henson Company to Disney. And this makes the film allowed to succeed, where it's just like, I didn't feel like it was a presentation done by a CEO, someone trying to honor Jim Henson and really capitalize on the Muppets. And I think that's largely due to Ron Howard being so willing to explore essentially reflect on his own career and just kind of reflect on what his career has meant to him, the innovation, what drives artists like him. And that's the framework of which we are watching this movie. And in that case, I found Jim Henson Idea Man a successful documentary, even if it does not fully avoid the tropes found within a celebrity biopic / documentary. Not biopic, documentary is the correct word. But I can definitely recommend this movie to anyone who enjoys Jim Henson's work. There is a lot to be learned about this guy, and there is just so much for people who love the Muppets. They are going to get joy learning about Muppets. They're going to get joy learning about Sesame Street, Labyrinth, Dark Crystal, all these just ideas that Jim Henson had swirling around his mind. You really feel it come to fruition in a documentary directed by Ron Howard that I just found quite literally at moments, I just found so impactful, especially where we just get to spend moments with Jim. And that's where I found it just so enlightening and a blast to watch. I can certainly suggest you go check out Jim Henson Idea Man on Disney Plus, now streaming. That's my review. On a scale of 5 stars, I'm going 3.5 stars out of 5. Thank you all for watching.